Solon is easily the most famous lawmaker of ancient Athens, and while we don't have many literary sources for the time before his reforms, the picture we do have of the period is pretty bleak. In his work, The Constitution of Athens, Aristotle tells us that there was contention for a long time between the upper classes and the populace. Not only was the constitution at this time oligarchical in every respect, but the poorer classes, men, women, and children, were the serfs of the rich. The whole country was in the hands of a few persons, and if the tenants failed to pay their rent, they were liable to be haled into slavery, and their children with them. All loans were secured upon the debtor's person, a custom which prevailed until the time of Solon, who was the first to appear as the champion of the people. But the hardest and bitterest part of the Constitution in the eyes of the masses was their state of serfdom. Since such, then, was the organization of the Constitution, and the many were in slavery to the few, the people rose against the upper class. The strife was keen, and for a long time the two parties were ranged in hostile camps against one another, till at last, by common consent, they appointed Solon to be mediator and archon, and committed the whole constitution to his hands. As soon as he was at the head of affairs, Solon liberated the people once and for all, by prohibiting all loans on the security of the debtor's person, and in addition he made laws by which he cancelled all debts, public and private. This measure is commonly called the removal of burdens, since thereby the people had their loads removed from them. Hey, I'm Matt, you're watching Nothing New, and today we're talking about Athens' most legendary lawgiver, and one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, Solon. While his reforms did not fully heal the divisions in the city, which would be taken over by the tyrant Pisistratus shortly before Solon's death, they were a very important first step towards the democracy that Athens would become in the 5th century BC. His reforms were not just political and economic, but also included moral reforms such as prohibiting dowries and, as we heard in the introduction, ending debt slavery. But before we get into it, want more content on ancient history and culture? Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We have new videos coming out every week. Anyways, let's get into it. Solon was born in Athens around 630 BC, and while Athens hadn't been ruled by a king for centuries, power was still firmly in the hands of the aristocracy. The city was run by 9 archons, or chief magistrates, and by the time of Solon, they were selected yearly based on wealth and prestige by the Council of the Areopagus. The main qualification to this powerful council of elders was to have previously been an archon, illustrating the consolidation of power that still remained centuries after the fall of traditional monarchy in Athens. In fact, one position, the archon basileus, is the political remnant of the old system, as it translates to king magistrate. But at least the role of archon wasn't hereditary, like it was before 753 BC. And by the time of Solon, the serving term of an archonship had been reduced from 10 years to just 1. By the 5th century, the position would be picked by lot out of the citizenry, and though this was still limited to the wealthier classes, before the reforms of Solon, the position was strictly reserved for the most preeminent of aristocratic families. As we heard in the introduction, the circumstances in Athens at that time were pretty harsh. We discussed in the video on Draco how, before Draco's constitution, oral law ruled the city. Aristocrats formed competing factions and used their wealth and power over the law to dispossess the underclass. Poor farmers would have to borrow seeds and livestock from rich neighbors to plant their crops, but when drought and overworked soil produced small harvests, their property would be seized to pay off the debt. Athens became a city of wealthy landowners, with the poor reduced to tenant farmers. Many could not grow enough to both feed their families and pay the rent they owed, and would end up being sold along with their family into slavery. On top of that were the famously harsh laws of Draco, where minor infractions like stealing a head of cabbage were punished by death. In my opinion, it's reminiscent of England during the early modern period, when during a period of profound social and technological change, increasing inequality was creating more and more dispossessed and desperate poor. A bill from 1547 subjected vagrants to 2 years' servitude and branding with a V as the penalty for the first offense, and death for the second. That's right, don't have a job? Off to the gallows. By the 1800s, at the height of what's become known as the Bloody Code, over 200 crimes were punishable by death, including being in the company of gypsies for 1 month and strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. Unfortunately, punishing the poor for being poor is nothing new. Anyways, hatred of the aristocracy in Athens quickly grew, and the poor demanded land reform which would break up the large estates. The factions which had risen in the city knew they needed a mediator to resolve these major issues, and so they looked to Solon. He was the son of an aristocrat, but his father had lost their family fortune, and Solon became a merchant to support himself and his family. By having one foot in both the aristocratic and working world, he appealed to both the poor and rich, and so he was elected archon in 594 BC. According to Plutarch, the wisest of the Athenians cast their eyes upon Solon. They saw that he was the one man least implicated in the errors of the time, that he was neither associated with the rich in their injustice, nor involved in the necessities of the poor. They therefore besought him to come forward publicly and put an end to the prevailing dissensions. Solon himself says that he entered public life reluctantly, and fearing one party's greed and the other party's arrogance. However, he was chosen archon and made mediator and legislator for the crisis, the rich accepting him readily because he was well-to-do, and the poor because he was honest. Therefore both parties were in high hopes, and their chief men persistently recommended a tyranny to Solon, and tried to persuade him to seize the city all the more confidently now that he had it completely in his power. Many citizens too, who belonged to neither party, seeing that it would be a laborious and difficult matter to effect a change by means of argument and law, were not reluctant to have one man, the justest and wisest of all, put at the head of the state. He pleased neither party, however. The rich were vexed because he took away their securities for debt, and the poor still more, because he did not redistribute the land as they had expected, nor make all men equal and alike in their way of living, as Lycurgus did. As mentioned in the intro, some of Solon's most important reforms were later named in celebration as the shaking off of burdens, which not only canceled all outstanding debts, but also emancipated all debt slaves, reinstated confiscated property, and forbade the practice of debt slavery in Athens. While slavery remained an essential component of classical life throughout both the Greek and Roman periods, as we covered in our video on Greek slavery, these reforms were an obvious step towards democratization and the relative political equality that the citizens of classical Athens would see. It's hard to overstate the bleak situation that poor Athenians were in before these reforms. Solon himself celebrates the return of those sold to foreign lands in his poetry. And many a man, whom fraud or law had sold, far from his God-built land, an outcast slave, I brought again to Athens. Yea, and some exiles from home through debt's oppressive load, speaking no more the dear Athenian tongue, but wandering far and wide, I brought again, and those that here in vilest slavery, crouched beneath a master's frown, I set them free. Thus might and right were yoked in harmony, since by the force of law I won my ends. He was so honest in his reforms that even when friends had purposely taken out loans from him, knowing he'd cancel all debts, he followed through with the reforms and forgave his generous loans to them. His laws would be inscribed on large wooden tablets on a series of axles in the Prytaneum, the seat of government in any ancient Greek city. The new constitution would reorganize the assembly, which now admitted all citizens, and lay out its powers as a court. Financial and social requirements for public offices were lowered, and the citizens were organized into 4 classes based on property. Solon made it possible for any citizen to bring charges on another citizen and seek justice for someone legally wronged, as opposed to the old system where only the actual victim could press charges, and was often intimidated against doing so. He abandoned almost every law from Draco's constitution, or at least reduced the harshness of the penalties, and only maintained the law on murder. Trade was encouraged as the exportation of olive oil was promoted and weights and measurements were revised, and fathers were even required to train their sons in a trade if they wanted to be taken care of in their old age. Foreign tradesmen were also encouraged to settle in Athens, with paths towards citizenship for those who brought their families. As Athens turned towards commerce and foreign trade, it would be transformed from an economy based on subsistence farming to the dominant maritime power in the Aegean. When his project of reform was complete, he bound the city with solemn oaths that they would maintain them for 10 years, and to ensure they could not persuade or harass him into changing the laws, he departed the city and traveled the ancient world. Classical writers such as Plato and Plutarch believed he traveled to important temples in Egypt and discussed philosophy with their wise priests. Herodotus says that he even visited the pharaoh Amasis II, and there is even a city in Cyprus named Soloi, whose construction was supposed to be overseen by Solon and named after him by the king. But his most legendary meeting would be with the king of Lydia, Croesus, the most wealthy man in antiquity. The kingdom of Lydia arose after the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of the Hittite Empire in western Anatolia, the home of modern-day Turkey. Croesus would be the last king of his line, and his hubristic attempt to conquer Persia ended with his own kingdom forever losing its liberty, a fitting end perhaps for the conqueror who first subjugated Asiatic Greek cities. As Herodotus describes that, before the reign of Croesus, all Greeks were free. But because Croesus felt an affinity for the Greeks, they seemed to do fairly well under his rule. According to Herodotus, he was generally kind to the Greek cities he conquered. He and his family found the spirit of Greece so admirable and influential that they claimed that they were descendants of Heracles. Though he was known for his wars and conquests, he would be remembered mainly for his immense wealth, especially his lavish offerings to Delphi, which could still be seen by Herodotus, and his funding of what would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. His wealth stemmed from being the first king in history to issue standardized gold coins for general circulation, and spawned a popular saying in ancient Greece, richest Croesus. We get the tale of the legendary meeting between one of Greece's 7 sages and the famous king of Lydia from Herodotus. We are told how he was entertained for days until finally Croesus had his attendants show Solon his treasures, pointing out the greatest and best of what he owned. After Solon was able to take in and appreciate the size of his wealth, the king posed him a question. "My Athenian guest, we have heard a lot about you because of your wisdom and of your wanderings. How as one who loves learning you have traveled much of the world for the sake of seeing it. So now I desire to ask you, who is the most fortunate man you have seen?" Herodotus tells us that Croesus asked this question believing that he was the most fortunate of men. But Solon, offering no flattery but keeping to the truth, said, "O king, it is Tellus the Athenian." Croesus was amazed at what he had said and replied sharply, "In what way do you judge Tellus to be the most fortunate?" Solon said, "Tellus was from a prosperous city, and his children were good and noble. He saw children born to them all, and all of these survived. His life was prosperous by our standards, and his death was most glorious. When the Athenians were fighting their neighbors in Eleusis, he came to help, routed the enemy, and died very finely. The Athenians buried him at public expense on the spot where he fell, and gave him much honor." Croesus was annoyed and surprised by this, and he could only think to ask, well then, who was the second most fortunate? Solon answered, "Cleobis and Bidon. They were of Argive stock, had enough to live on, and on top of this had great bodily strength. Both had won prizes in the athletic contests, and this story is told about them. There was a festival of Hera in Argos, and their mother absolutely had to be conveyed to the temple by a team of oxen. But their oxen had not come back from the fields in time. So the youths took the yoke upon their shoulders under constraint of time. They drew the wagon, with their mother riding atop it, traveling 5 miles until they arrived at the temple. When they had done this, and had been seen by the entire gathering, their lives came to an excellent end, and in their case the god made clear that for human beings it is a better thing to die than to live. The Argive men stood around the youths and congratulated them on their strength. The Argive women congratulated their mother for having borne such children. She was overjoyed at the feat and at the praise, so she stood before the image and prayed that the goddess might grant the best thing for man to her children, Cleobis and Bidon, who had given great honor to the goddess. After this prayer, they sacrificed and feasted. The brothers then lay down in the temple and went to sleep and never rose again. Death held them there. The Argives made and dedicated at Delphi statues of them as being the best of men. I want to pause here and point out that this is one of the most famous stories about one of the most famous figures in Athens, told by one of the most famous historians. Socrates had to have heard this story, and it just makes me think, did it influence his views on death? We'll never be able to answer questions like these, but it just makes you wonder. Anyways, Croesus was vexed and said, "My Athenian guest, do you so much despise our happiness that you do not even make us worth as much as common men?" Solon replied, "Croesus, you ask me about human affairs. and I know that the divine is entirely grudging and troublesome to us. In a long span of time, it is possible to see many things that you do not want to, and to suffer them too. I set the limit of a man's life at 70 years. Out of all these days in the 70 years, all 26,250 of them, not one brings anything at all like another. So Croesus, man is entirely chance. To me you seem to be very rich and to be king of many people, but I cannot answer your question before I learn that you ended your life well. The very rich man is not more fortunate than the man who has only his daily needs, unless he chances to end his life with all well. Many very rich men are unfortunate. Many of moderate means are lucky. The man who is very rich but unfortunate surpasses the lucky man in only two ways, while the lucky surpasses the rich but unfortunate in many. The rich man is more capable of fulfilling his appetites and of bearing a great disaster that falls upon him, and it is in these ways that he surpasses the other. The lucky man is not so able to support disaster or appetite as is the rich man, but his luck keeps these things away from him, and he is free from deformity and disease, has no experience of evils, and has fine children and good looks. If besides all this he ends his life well, then he is the one whom you seek, the one worthy to be called fortunate. But refrain from calling him fortunate before he dies, call him lucky. It is impossible for one who is only human to obtain all these things at the same time, just as no land is self-sufficient in what it produces. Each country has one thing but lacks another. Whichever has the most is the best, just so no human being is self-sufficient. Each person has one thing but lacks another. Whoever passes through life with the most and then dies agreeably is the one who, in my opinion, O king, deserves to bear this name. It is necessary to see how the end of every affair turns out, for the god promises fortune to many people and then utterly ruins them. By saying this, Solon did not at all please Croesus, who sent him away without regard for him, but thinking him a great fool, because he ignored the present good and told him to look to the end of every affair. If you've read your Herodotus, you'll know how wise Solon was in not declaring Croesus as the most fortunate of all, since the rest of his life would be full of ironic tragedy. It was a classic case of divine justice for a hubristic king, and Herodotus tells us that, after Solon's departure, divine retribution fell heavily on Croesus, as I guess because he supposed himself to be blessed beyond all other men. When Solon returned to Athens, he once again found the city divided into regional factions headed by prominent nobles. He urgently warned his city against the ambitions of his old friend and distant relative Pisistratus, and reproached the Athenians for being cowards in defending him. While it would take further reforms from Cleisthenes to firmly establish democracy after the tyranny of the Pisistratids, we shouldn't forget how important Solon's constitution was in working towards a more just society. Simple reforms such as allowing any citizen to indict another when a crime had occurred, and not just the victim or their relatives, spread the spirit of justice to the community at large. For the first time in history, court cases were pursued and presided on by the citizens, and in general, the political offices that administered the state were more open to the population than ever before. While the intensified competition for these positions may have played a role in the civil strife which would result in the tyranny of Pisistratus, we'll see that the tyrants of archaic Greece aren't exactly what we might imagine. Pisistratus not only maintained the reforms of Solon, but expanded them as Athens' economic power grew, and his rule would be characterized as moderate and mild by Aristotle. But we're going to have to save all of that for next time, when we discuss the tyranny of the Pisistratids and the resulting reforms of Cleisthenes, who's been called the father of Athenian democracy. That's coming up next in our series on the famous lawgivers and tyrants of ancient Greece. I hope you're excited, and I'll see you then.